So good evening, everybody. My name is Shriya Gautam. I am an alumna of the School of Archaeology, University of Oxford. I'm currently involved with Speaking Archaeologically, which you've heard about. This is an archaeological education group based in North India, and together we deal with documenting vulnerable sites, vulnerable objects, as well as creating public awareness in India. We also carry out various projects throughout India, and this particular paper that I'm going to talk about stems from one such project, which was about Gurjar Pratihars. Now, ironically, this project stemmed from one very dilapidated site in North India and later assumed orangutan proportions, much to my dismay and much to the fact that it was pinning me down to just one particular type of sites. Anyway, while studying and documenting these temples for posterity, we realized a rather unusual thing about them. And without creating more suspense, let's get started about what that unusual thing is. So the basic premise of the study is that religious structures in India are almost built along or close to trade routes, or so the texts tell us. Now, how much of this hypothesis is correct is something that we wanted to investigate. One of the main reasons that is stated in a lot of books by a lot of historians, as well as a lot of Indian treatises on trade, is that religious sites could be used as makeshift banks because they always had ready cash available with them. And they were very similar to what caravanserais came to be in late medieval times and in Mughal India. So there were quite a lot of texts that corroborate this, but we did not have a lot of archaeology to begin with, and that's what we wanted to test with it. One such text was the Arthashastra, written by Kautilya or Chanakya, dates back to the Mauryan Empire supposedly, but its dating is very much debated. Another such thing is the Hundi system, which again a lot of historians associate with medieval India, but there are historical parallels in textual sources that sort of show us that this system originated in ancient India. Again, all of this is text and none of it was archaeology, which is why we wanted to test whether this hypothesis is correct and if really religious structures were built along trade routes. Now, one of the fascinating things about trade routes is most imagery with trade route is often associated with fabulous, thriving cities. And that was not essentially the case with these temples and where they were located in the present context. Indeed, a lot of their archaeology was lost. So by the time we hit these temples, there was no future scope of excavation. All one could practically do was document this. Also because if you notice in this particular image, the underlying area on which the temple has been built has been cemented now using concrete. So there's no scope of excavating these sites. So for the purpose of this paper, we started documenting Gurjar Pratihar sites, dating them, documenting them, and recording them. And in the map that you see here, these are all the sites that we've been documenting for the period of 4 years until we were hit by the pandemic, which sort of hampered our ability to move eastwards and chase their trail all along. Now, a pertinent question here might be, why study Pratihara temples? Why not study stupas, which are much earlier in nature and which are definitely linked with trade? One obvious answer to that is because a lot of sites which were important have already been studied. And the Gurjar Pratihara temples, interestingly, are some of the most commonly found sites scattered all over North India. Several of these sites, like I've already mentioned, have lost their archaeological context, chiefly because of absence of any primary inscriptions on sites, but also because of natural and anthropogenic factors. One of the biggest natural factor that affected most of these sites was the 1905 earthquake that happened in North India, because of which a lot of these sites were lost to us. So all we have is the remains. Another problem was deliberate demolition, which is attributed to the political setup of the early medieval times in India, specifically invaders and raiding of these temples for whatever they possessed. So that led to remodeling and reconstruction of several of these sites. So whatever we have now is hugely remodeled, hugely reconstructed, and it has totally stripped these temples of their archaeological context. I will show you that in the next slide here. This is an example, and I'm going to show you 3 such sites which show how different these temples look now. So these are 2 temples. One of them is in extreme North India, another one is in central India, well, north central India. And if you look at these, they don't look like Pratihara temples or medieval sites at all. Indeed, they've been rebuilt absolutely from the scratch after the 1905 earthquake in the left image and after a supposed invasion raid in the second image. Indeed, these temples would be impossible to identify if it wasn't for architectural embedding, as you can see in these two temples. So this is yet another temple we found in North Haryana. And if it wasn't for the architectural members that you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you can see the architectural members embedded here, if it weren't for these things and if it weren't for iconographic analysis, indeed it would be impossible to identify this temple as Gurjar Pratihar. Same is the case with this temple, which you also saw in the previous slide. This was destroyed in the 1905 earthquake. If it wasn't for the architectural embedding that you find here, all of this has now been built in the 16th century vernacular architecture from the area. Now, on one hand, we had sites which looked like this, which are, well, compared to the rest of them, pretty intact. But on the other hand, we also had sites which looked like this one here. And this was one of the sites that we began our investigations with. So, central to all of these sites, while we were working on them, was the fact that they were very, very close to modern-day roads in India, which was slightly unnerving for us because some of them are in really obscure towns and you wouldn't expect that to be a town of importance by any of the modern standards, even in India today. Really obscure towns, some of them really very small villages, and almost nobody knows of these sites, but they happen to be on the national highway, interestingly. So we mapped these sites along the national highway, and the next part of our study was to map them with respect to the national highway. And it is while we were doing this that we were struck by the fabulous book Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan, also from Oxford, who I met briefly while I was at Oxford. And it was his reconstruction of the maps, specifically the trade routes in India in his book, that made me do something like this. So on one hand, I have the trade route of the 9th century here, and on the other hand, you have the trade centers as marked by these temples. Now, interestingly for us, a lot of these temples, while we were mapping this down, a lot of these temples, indeed all of these temples, fell along the trade route, which is pretty much a spectacular find if you think about archaeology. Archaeology is a discipline where things happen randomly, but they don't really happen in a pattern. And here we were along NH1A, realizing every single site fell along this path. Indeed, if it weren't for the pandemic, we probably would have moved eastwards and westwards and mapped this even further. So, before moving on then, let's talk about Gurjar Pratihars and who they were. Now, evidently, for any dynasty to commission so many temples, they had to be pretty important. Unfortunately for us, Gurjar Pratihars are one of those dynasties in India that are not studied quite a lot, predominantly because the early historians about them were either white or male and are currently no longer alive, and they didn't put much by the Gurjar Pratihars. They didn't think they were that important. Certainly there were other dynasties that soon rose to power and became more important than the Gurjar Pratihars ever were. So that got me particularly involved into tracing down their history and their politics and their social economic schemes, while others in my group started working on the architecture of these temples and the archaeological aspects of these temples, as well as their iconography. So while working on their political setup, I found out these were one of the first 4 patrilineal clans of the ethnic caste group that identifies itself as Rajputs today. They rose into political power somewhere around the 7th and the 8th century and quickly started expanding all over North India. So indeed, their point of origin was somewhere here where my cursor is, in modern-day Gujarat area, which is where they derive their name also from, supposedly. And they quickly started expanding northwards and then eastwards. After a significant period of ruling all over this area, they started disintegrating, where their feudatories claimed themselves to be the next set of Rajputs that emerged from them. More on that later. So once Pratihars had started expanding politically as an imperial power, chiefly under Nagbhatta II, one of the most important Pratihara rulers that you might find mentioned in some of the history books that you have today, he undertook massive construction of temples in almost every new area that he conquered. And the construction project became so widespread that the temples, when we started studying them, we realized that you could easily date those temples and classify them into different phases. So here I have a table which tells you about different phases, and the first phase starts around 725 CE. This is a period of experimentation where they're making all kinds of temples with all kinds of floor plans, and it is really a combination. At this point, the temples are really localized, so you only find them in the western and northwestern India. They slowly move northwards, and that's where the second phase starts, circa 800 CE, where they gradually show a preference towards a rectangular plan, but a square entrance to the temple. And from that, they move on to phase 3, which is the last phase. And this continues pretty much until the 12th century, although I do talk about this extending only to 900s in this particular slide. But we later found out that it extends right up to the 12th century. And this is where there is very little variation, and they suddenly start preferring circular floor plans. So while we are doing this and we are looking deeper into what these people have done, we suddenly find ourselves dealing with a text called Al-Biruni's India. This is a text which ironically you will have to read if you're dealing with any sites that are a part of the supposed raids that eventually happened in the 11th century. So we were studying Al-Biruni's India, and one of my colleagues who is absolutely in love with everything Arabic and Persian started reading this and started trying to figure out what places are where as per Al-Biruni's India. So he started mapping the location of the places Al-Biruni mentions in this text. Now, I was very skeptical about this initially because Al-Biruni has a lot of vagueness with respect to identification of the sites. So if you were to do what Alexander Cunningham did earlier in India, which was taking up a travelogue and mapping all the sites, archaeological sites, according to those travelogues, it would no longer be possible because A, Al-Biruni is very vague, and B, all these sites have been remodified since the independence. They no longer look the same. But interestingly, 7 among these sites, and we studied 12 sites for the purpose of this paper, were directly mentioned by Al-Biruni as trade towns. Now, these sites, might I remind you, have no modern indications of ever being an ancient trade town. But ironically, there are villages that still exist by that very name, and they exist on this very route, which is the National Highway 1A today. So, why have temples in trade towns at all? Religious fervor or building spree of the Pratihars? Well, that sort of brought us back to the assumption that where trade leads, culture essentially follows. So from the earliest times up until late medieval period in India at least, trade towns throughout India have been categorically closed to towns of religious importance. So whether I'm talking Banaras or Allahabad, these are all towns that are very much on the trade route itself, and they are a part of the trading towns as well. The proximity of these towns to religious centers served many purposes, and one of the most obvious ones is if you were a monk or a priest living in a temple, I think things would be very easily available to you if you were located near a trade town. Also, temples could have served as resting places for travelers. Much like churches, temples have accommodation even today, and they provide you free lodging and free food. By and large, religious places also happen to have a large amount of money donated to them. And we find that true also in the case of caves of the Western Ghats, where all the caves that you find along the Western Ghats were on important port towns in Western India. So by the same logic, you will have a lot of money donated to them by patrons. And if you were a traveler and if you were traveling along the trade route, you would probably go deposit your money there, get something written by way of a bill of exchange, and get it encashed at another town altogether, just like a modern day ATM machine. Now, to test this, whether this was true or this was a hypothesis that we could rely on, I individually conducted a few ethno-archaeological investigations, and one of the most important finds that I had from this investigation was a lot of deities have traveled a long distance into a new town altogether where nobody really knows about them because of trade. One such example is a deity in Assam, which is worshipped in northeast India. now being worshipped also in North India, so extreme North India. And the only thing linking them was the fact that there's a story, a set of travelers went from this town to that town through an ancient trade route, lost all their money, and were able to retrieve the cash from that temple in Assam. As a result of gratitude and for thanking the deity, they brought the deity home and installed her in a temple of her own right in this new part as well. A similar story is also found from the 13th century temple, which was originally thought by us to be Gurjar Pratihar, which was built by two traveling brothers who had earned a lot of money in that particular town when they'd come in as traders. And in this temple, ironically, we were able to find an inscription. So, all of this brings us back to the Arthashastra, which is the text that originally asserts that trade towns should have temples in them. And this text, which, well, the earliest known archaeological manuscript dates back from the 3rd century CE, but it is supposedly written in the 3rd century BCE. And in this book, there are some very interesting recommendations for the future king and what his attitude towards trade and trade routes should be, and what kind of infrastructure should exist in trading town. So trade, as per Kautilya, the writer of Arthashastra, thrives in areas where there's loose political suzerainty. However, these are towns which should be provided with good infrastructure and mainly should have sites of religious importance for the welfare of traders and travelers. This is Arthashastra Book 2. There also must be a nexus of alternative trade routes within a particular political economic unit to provide alternate means of travel in times of contingency. So if you were attacked, there must be alternative routes. That also explains why some of these temples are in really obscure locations. They probably lay along inland trade routes and not the major trade route itself or the Uttar Path. Kautilya also recommends that a 10% profit margin be offered to traders who initiate the building of temples, but also roads and bridges in a trading town. So if you were doing that, you were essentially winning favors from the king. And that sort of brought us back to the Pratihars. Were the Pratihars following the Arthashastra? Regardless of whenever it was written, the Pratihars were literally following it by the book in the 8th and the 9th century. Almost all these temples are located on trade towns, and some of them are located at ridiculous distances. Like one of the sites that we were working on, it was close to 3 such sites within the radius of 20-minute drive by a modern car. So it wouldn't have taken you very long even on horseback to travel from one such town to another. It made no sense whatsoever why you would have another temple there altogether unless the temple was meant as a resting house. So we at Speaking Archaeologically eventually compiled our research into a book, which if you are at the department at Oxford, you might be able to find a copy lying there because it was sent to the Dean just last month before we were hit by lockdown again. We photographed and documented and recorded the more vulnerable sites among all these temples, and we made their floor plans and illustrations, and we published this in the book that you see on the slide amidst COVID lockdown in 2020. With that, I would like to bring an end to this presentation, and I would like to thank everybody here tonight who took out time to listen to me, and also to GAO for letting me talk about this. I'd like to thank my co-editor and partner in crime, also fellow Persian and Arabic lover, Divyansh Thakur, who probably forced a lot of these books down my hand. I would thank Siddharth, who's our chief illustrator, and Priyanshu, who was our chief cartographer, but also everybody involved in proofreading and principal photography, as well as site survey with us. Here is a list of selected bibliography from this paper, and if there are any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. Thank you so much for your patience.